Hello and welcome to everyone, both here in the room and online, to this event today hosted by the International Inequality Institute. My name is Francisco Ferreira and I'm delighted to be chairing it. The title of the event is Richer and More Equal, New History of Wealth in the West, which is the title of the latest book by Daniel Waldenström. And I'm delighted that he's here with us today. He's let me just briefly introduce him without reading his entire CV. He's a professor of economics and director for the research program Taxation and Society at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Stockholm. He received his first PhD from Stockholm School of Economics and then his second PhD in economic history from Lund University. So for any of you who are still doing one PhD, you can always do another if you like. Then you know how that works. He's worked at the University of UCLA, at the Stockholm School of Economics, at Uppsala University, and at the Paris School of Economics. And his work, as many of you know, concerns inequality, taxation, fiscal policy, and economic theory. So I'm going to hand over to Daniel. He says he's quite happy to take questions as we go. So feel free to ask clarifying questions. If you ask too much, he'll manage that himself and tell you to stop bothering him. And at the end, there may be a few minutes for people online to ask some questions as well.
Thank you, Chico, and thank you, LSE International Inequalities Institute for inviting me. Super excited to talk about these things that I have been working on and thinking about for many years. So this is a book about a specific kind of inequality, wealth inequality. So here's the book, and I'm gonna, circulate it. There is like some small paper that you can use if you want to have a discounted copy. But I guess it's available in libraries as well. Anyway, so the title says, "Richer and More Equal: A New History of Wealth in the West." It's a kind of a daring title in a way, and maybe a bit pretentious as well, but it's deliberate. So I mean, these are thoughts that I kind of grown in me for many years, and I'm happy to be able to kind of provide this narrative that I hope will be convincing to some, but I'm also expecting critical questions, and as Chico said, I'd be happy to take other kind of clarifying questions or along the way. So the starting point are kind of a set of graphs that maybe some of you have seen, made by my former colleague in Paris, Thomas Piketty, who's been like a champion in inequality research and has shaped this literature, especially when it comes to the historical aspects of the trends in inequality over like the last century. And I've been part of that literature, so this is also very close to my own work. But so, if I may, I like try to condense or distill the work of Thomas and his collaborators in 3 bullet points. You could and also 2 graphs, specifically then with respect to the wealth aspect, is that the first point is basically that unfettered capitalism creates this accumulation of wealth. Extreme wealth inequality. So these are the raw capitalist forces that we could see up until the end of the 19th century, more or less. And this is something that we can look at data, with the historical data, what did it create in terms of capital and inequality. The second point says that, but during the 20th century, something happened. Well, according to that narrative, I mean, what happened was we had shocks to capital. The shocks were hitting the rich primarily. So it came through wars that had both like the direct destruction, bombings of structures and so on, factories, but also a regulatory framework and taxation that came up with the taxes. I mean, the Weizmann work on the growth of public expenditures is like clearly showing this, of course, historically. And the equalization that came along with this is an equalization of lowering the top. Taking down the wealth of the rich creates equality, has created equality historically. But then something else happened around 1980. What was that? Well, it was something that came in the West in terms of like a readdressment of the issues and interpretations of what kind of policies should we have. So we had a deregulation wave of all these old wartime regulations that have been around in most product markets, because we saw that what happened was that we had a stagnating economy in the Western world. So our industries were failing, and we thought we could support them and get them thriving again by industrial policy. But it didn't help. In fact, it just created inflation and continued deteriorated productivity and competitiveness. So then what happened was that we switched gears and started deregulating our economies, lowering our very high taxes, historically high taxes, to do what? Well, we needed to energize, we needed to inspire, incentivize people to work harder, to educate themselves, to take more risks, create ventures and firms that could create new services and products and hire people, of course, and then also to pay taxes. So this then boosted the economic income growth and the capital values in the West since that change, that policy change, you could say. And the question is, did it also boost wealth inequality? Well, according to at least, I think, what many of you have heard, yes, it did, according to this previous narrative. And I usually say that if I could have got like $1 for every paper that begins with, we've seen an explosion in wealth inequality over the recent years, I would be pretty rich as of today. In my book, I take a little bit of a different stance on this history writing, but I'm not alone. In fact, in the recent years, there have been a flood of papers coming out, enriching this literature, which has been very narrow. So previously, almost all inequality research was about income inequality. And I think that's for good reason. I think incomes are what we care the most about, and they're closely related to welfare aspect. But wealth also matters. So the wealth literature has grown much thanks to the work by Thomas, and has kind of added more countries and more aspects and more results. And that has made us to kind of revise a little bit some of the empirical facts, but I also think it revises and helps us revising the interpretation of what has happened. So 3 facts, I think, that stand out. So the book are these 3 facts. So the book, if I may, is not written like as an academic textbook. It's not, but it's more like a trade book for the airport book sales stores. Unfortunately, every time I go flying, I have to like look for it, but I haven't seen it yet. So people haven't really understood how good it is. So, and anyway, no, I'm not kidding. But I'm just kidding. 3 facts that I think are coming out from the history of wealth. One is that we are richer today. The second fact is that wealth is actually very different today than what it was in the past. And the third fact, we are more equal today than we were in the past. There are qualifications, of course, to everything of this. So this first fact, I mean, this is like an average per capita wealth in the 6 countries for which I will mainly look at in the analysis. These are the 6 countries which have variables that cover this long time period that I study in most dimensions. These are France, Germany, UK, Spain, Sweden, and the US. I mean, we could say a lot about this graph, but it shows us that in real terms, we have more resources today. The pie has grown in terms of wealth. It says nothing about distribution, of course. It also says that a lot of these things happened in pretty recent years. And of course, this is also something that I talk about in the book, what drives wealth growth. I mean, it's either saving, like the volume growth, or it's like a relative price effects, capital gains. So some of these are capital gains coming perhaps from like restrictions to supply of housing or whatever. The second fact is this thing that wealth is different. I mean, money is neutral. I mean, we usually say that it doesn't matter where it comes from or how we use it, it's just like money. Wealth is not neutral. It matters what wealth we have. Imagine if the middle class in Germany in 1923 would have not had a lot of their savings in bank deposits, but instead in gold or maybe housing. they would not have been as prone to or like affected by the hyperinflation that made many of them impoverished. We could just think about what would have happened next in terms of the political development. But my point is, and I write in the book, I mean, what kind of housing, I mean, rented housing, my parents, when they divorced in the 90s, would not have accepted these really good contracts for rental apartments in the center of Stockholm, that they of course got by having good contacts, which you need in a rental controlled market. But instead have purchased tenant-owned apartments, they would have become much more wealthy today at 30 years later. So housing, the kind of how you compose your portfolio. So this picture shows that if we divide all assets into two categories, one is the blue category, which contains the stuff that you and I hold, the homes we own and our long-term savings, mostly in pension funds. And then we have another part which is like agricultural land, other kind of land maybe, and then industrial shares of corporations. We see that the share of total assets of the stuff that ordinary middle class households own, homes, pension funds, has gone from being around 25% of total assets in the economy 100 years ago to 75 or even 80% today. So this is an average for all Western countries. It's a huge shift. So, and this is also going to inform us about how we interpret inequality trends when we have increasing asset prices on the stock market. Well, we know then that we mostly hold a lot of stuff on the stock market, of the shares, through our pension savings. So this has distributional implications. Yeah.
So, you know, you have here over 100 years, and so obviously there's some price deflator going on in there, so it's in real terms, right?
But this is a composition. This is just shares.
Right, but it's, well, so they're shares, and then price indices would not matter only if the same one was used throughout. And that's where my question is going to go. Okay, so cash, stocks, pension funds are stores of value that you can use to buy lots of things. Housing seems to me it's a little bit different. It is a store of value, but it's also a specific good that people need to consume. Right? So I think there could be an argument for deflating housing, the value of housing, using a housing price index rather than a CPI. And if you did that, it would affect the shares, right? Because they're not the same price indices. And I wonder if you tried that, or if you think there's any merit to that idea.
I mean, I think it has a merit to it, of course. So these numbers, and I think most of the wealth analysis that I will talk about will look at the assets that we have at each point in time and try to see how valuable are they in the market. So we could definitely try to, when we look at real purchasing power of assets, especially where we only, for example, look at volume effect, or if you want to look at that, I mean, then we could want to play around with different kinds of price indices. I mean, I think, but in terms of measurement, so I mean, in passing, measuring wealth is difficult. I will talk about this a bit later, but we should always be more careful with wealth measurement, wealth inequality measurement, because of the problems of defining wealth, measuring wealth, then actually with income. Income flows are much more easily defined. It doesn't really, so I think your point doesn't really affect this result, but please come back if you think that, if you have some more leverage on some of the other conclusions. So the third fact then, about we are more equal today. This is in wealth terms, but so here, two groupings of people in the West. So the lower 9/10 of all households, we in the blue dashed line sum up their wealth in one total sum in real terms, and then we have this red line with the richest percentile group and all of their wealth, the sum of their wealth. So this picture just shows you that a long time ago, this tiny group of elite people were 4 to 5 times richer than the 90% of the poorest in the populations. So very large inequality by any means, I would say. And that is, but we see that over the 20th century that the amount of wealth held by this bottom group has grown faster than the wealth held by this elite group. In the recent years, we see that both groups actually have experienced high wealth growth. And of course, per capita within these groups, I mean, the red line is much higher. But it just shows you that the values that have been generated in the big population has been quite notable, also in relative terms over time. This picture,
Presumably Chico's point is actually quite important for the slide you just. Yeah, because the lower 90% with their wealth predominantly in the form of households, the house, and so on. That's going to make a big difference. You dropped your graph. Oh, sorry.
I may be too slow. I may be too slow to see that. So in each point of time, I take the volumes that people have and I put a market price on them. And then I don't see how that deflation.
Well, if you're applying a different price index to the house.
Of course, it's a measurement of we could always mismeasure the stock of the stock value of housing. Fair enough.
Just to elaborate on that, you're not gonna, if you haven't done it, you're not gonna have the answer, that's fine, but just to think about,
Yes,
conceptually, these are values here. I think so these are values, presumably they are deflated by the CPI.
Okay. Yes, presumably they are deflated by. Oh no, I see your point. Okay, sorry.
They're deflated by the CPI.
So these are current value, fixed prices. That's right.
What I am saying is that it's fine to deflate stocks, bonds, pensions by the CPI. Housing, because it's also a particular good that people have to consume, and the price of which, the relative price of which has risen a great deal. If you deflated it by the housing price index, you get a different picture.
Thanks. Now, even I could understand your point. So yes, of course. So by deflating with CPI, or we could have GDP, doesn't matter if we have large heterogeneity in price different evolutions of the consumption basket, like the asset portfolio. That's right. Okay. Now I understand. Neil, did you have a comment or did you just want to help?
No, it was on this. I think it would be an interesting empirical exercise to do this with the housing prices, but at least for England, when you look at the share of assets by percentile, the top 1% have assets that have been getting a greater return over the 20th century. So that's also another aspect that makes this surprising. But then I'm thinking that still doesn't answer the asset price expansion of at least in this country since the 1980s. So I mean, part of this will be attenuated a little bit by that.
So Frank.
Well, just sorry to carry on the same song before, but you probably know this already. A few years ago, that's my income study, when we were talking about loose wealth study there. And I was talking to somebody from who provided the data from Norway. And while I was doing comparison some various European, North American countries, and I was amazed by the bizarre Lorenz curves I was getting from Norway because they were sort of dipping right down with sort of these huge negative values of net worth. Just, oh, well, that's easy because the data come from the tax authority in Norway, and we put a different price index in. It's not the market value there because you should explain the whole thing, but it completely reversed the picture. Oh, I've got in there. Don't touch Norway.
No, but you're perfectly right, and this is something that has plagued. So what Frank was talking about is that, I mean, is once again the problem of measuring assets. I think, especially here in the context of having liabilities. So we see people's mortgages at full market price, whereas their homes are imperfectly measured, and this has effects. So this picture, again, iterates on this result of, and I think this is one of the main picture, maybe the main picture of my book. And I think it's important So it shows the historical evolution of wealth inequality measured as the 1% share of total wealth in a number in these 5 European countries in my core sample and in the US. So there are so many things to talk about in this picture, and I don't have the time, but for Europe, we can just see that Europe was a much more unequal place 100 years ago than it is today. And this is in, I think, the UK. In fact, I think that the 70+% share of total wealth held by this top elite percentage group, I think it may be the most unequal wealth distribution in the world history. There are some historical ancient data, Fani, Peter Linnert, Williamson, and Branco, and so on. And I haven't seen any such high number for any country at any point in time. Anyway, but we also see this fantastic, interesting equalization of wealth concentration over the 20th century. It's fascinating also because it's so similar in these European countries, despite them following quite different historical paths. I think this is something we will come back to when we think about the role of the wars. That has been highlighted as the necessary condition for sustained wealth equalization, as some historians have proposed. Here in the left picture, we have some countries that were in the world wars, but also some countries that weren't. Sweden, Spain weren't in the wars. We were affected by war-related maybe regulation, but it just says that the role of wars as a sharper capital is perhaps not as important that has been proposed. The other thing is how constant, at relatively low levels of wealth concentration that these European countries have been on since the 1980s. For US, it's a little bit different picture. It was less concentrated in the past, but we see a clearer increase in wealth concentration over the recent decades. I have 3 different graphs or series. It's because there's an ongoing debate in the US. I don't know if you've seen it, but how should, what kind of wealth distribution do we actually have, depending on what data, how to measure, and so on. And this is like, although I, as an economic historian, I think this long-run perspective is interesting. If I talk to the statistical agencies, for them, 1980, that's a distant history as well. So let's look at this historical picture. Wealth inequality, wealth concentration in Europe, also Canada, Australia, since the 80s. I think it's fascinating that we don't have this explosion in wealth inequality or great inequality reversal that we hear about all the time. I recall one of the best data series here is the Danish one. It's hardly to be seen, but it's the green with diamonds by using Danish admin data. And I recall when I got it. So since early 1990s, it hasn't really changed at all, even though we had really top of the line data, because I think that was an interesting, because data sometimes it can be driving, results as well. But then of course, let's be clear, US and Europe, or the rest of the West actually, in this previous picture we had Canada and Australia. US follows a different pattern. It's a different economy, it's a different society. And let's be clear about this because it's far too common that people in our countries in Europe adapt a US narrative and how the world looks and also what kind of solutions is to be there and apply it on our own country. I think we should always, I think in academia it's common because we want to publish in American journals, right? But we should be very careful about doing this. Okay, so this is, I need to, shamelessly self-promote. These are like 4 of my most starkest idols in academia, and they were kind enough to kind of endorse my book. These are like Ray Clark, economic historian, has been champion on really providing understanding of the longer history. Daron, of course, was became extra famous the other day with the prize, and Branko Milanovic has been really championed the literature on historical wealth inequality, and David Stasavich is a political science professor at NYU, and he and Ken Sheed, his collaborator, had a really important book about taxing, called Taxing the Rich, where they describe their research on what has driven the increases in tax progressivity over the 20th century and how the role of institutions. Okay, so I have some slides, and bear with me if I jump over them. I mean, I want to show them all. Okay, so this slide shows that, I mean, I just want to mention wealth. Some of you may not have worked with wealth, and it's understandable. Wealth, in this analysis and in all the kind of research and statistical analysis, is defined as like a net worth concept. So we take the market value of all the stuff that we own. So the non-financial assets like properties, dwellings, homes, or land, market valued, and then also the financial assets. So what we have in the bank, the shares we own, mutual funds, pension funds, and then we subtract our loans, or our debts, sorry, the mortgages and the student loans. So this is going to be the wealth concept, the net wealth concept that we read. So here in the second category, there are some of the problems that we face when measuring wealth and wealth inequality. So hidden offshore wealth. Any scientist's nightmare is to have these column effects. Columns that we miss or column shifts over time even. I have a chapter in the book where I look how we have some rich people hiding wealth in tax havens. How big wealth do we have there, and does it change the picture? Transfer wealth or unfunded pensions, so the drawing rights of future pension incomes. So we're taxed today, social security contributions that allows us to have these future incomes. But maybe also if you expand this notion, social security wealth. So if you get sick or unemployed, maybe even so anyway, everything that we haven't saved for privately because we can't, we're taxed. But there are still values. Some countries actually do have less of the taxation and more of private wealth accumulation. So this second point is actually important in the comparative context across countries. Government wealth, national wealth, how important is that? And inheritance is another spectrum of understanding wealth inequality that I will come back to. Okay, so this is again showing this graph of real wealth per capita wealth in the 6 countries that I talked about has gone up. Another historically interesting measure of the size of wealth is the capital income ratio or the wealth income ratio. So instead of dividing the total amount of wealth by the number of inhabitants, we divide it by national income. So this gives us a measure of the economic importance of wealth in the aggregate. And here we see a little bit different picture. In France, for example, it was much, much higher in the 19th century than it is today. And it's like a U shape. A U shape is a very popular shape in the inequality literature, by the way. But it's not U-shaped everywhere. It's U-shaped in Germany, I would say, but not so much in Spain. It's more like it has gone up here. We have one of the authors behind this series sitting in the audience, Luis. Sweden that I created is a little bit U-shaped, has gone up very much. UK is an open question. Actually, we have a revised series for UK. Jacob Madsen recently updated that and came to a very different standpoint on how large wealth values did we have in the 19th century. And this is actually something we saw a little bit for Germany also, that was also updated. And we also saw new studies that weren't in Thomas' earlier work with Spain and Sweden. So how important was wealth in the aggregate in the 19th century as compared to today? It was very important in Europe and not so important in the US in the previous narrative. In the newer narrative, maybe it was never that important. The question is not settled. There will be more countries. There are very few countries here. There's a new paper on Netherlands. There's a paper on Italy. So this figure will be revised, but this tells us also a little bit about how was wealth and capital accumulating in the raw capitalist era. So was a kind of total different kind of law of motion, and also if we were deregulating the markets, are we going back to this or that? This is something about our understanding about capitalist economies. that we may need to rethink. Okay. So in terms of, now I go into a little bit more of this second fact, the composition of wealth. And this is something that UK has been early on in studying, especially Tony Atkinson and Alan Harrison's famous book from the 70s of the wealth distribution in Great Britain. They talk precisely about the growth of, household wealth and the assets that households own. I talk about the pillars of household wealth, the homes and the pensions, the second fact that you saw. And this picture kind of confirms this with modern data. This is a snapshot from Sweden showing the holdings of every Swedish adult in the entire wealth distribution, from the poorest person, these are lined up and ranked from the poorest guy to the very richest guy. And what we see is that for the vast majority of Swedes, 80–90% of their assets are these two pillars, like homes and the pension funds. Whereas when we go to the very top, it's instead business assets that totally dominate. So here, this is what we will think about, what I'm thinking about also when we think about this shift in the composition of wealth in our world, and also how it, what is happening when we have asset price effects. When house prices increase, who will benefit? Well, middle class people. But stock prices, is it only the rich one who will benefit? Yeah, well, of course they will benefit. We have a lot of that too. And this is like a very important change that we'll come back to. So looking historically, so home ownership has become more important for different reasons. And we see that countries, this is Sebastian Kohl, a German researcher that collected historical series. But we just see that all of the Western countries on this graph experiences increasing home ownership rates among people. And it goes pretty fast. And we go from 20–40% before, in the early part of the 20th century to maybe 45–50 to 80% or even higher. And this is not a causal graph, but it's a part of our understanding of what home ownership does to wealth inequality. So it basically plots home ownership rates across OECD countries, and then, or EU countries, you could say, a little bit expanded, with the wealth inequality measured as the Gini coefficient. Because then we see a very clear negative correlation.
So excuse me, just a clarification question. The home ownership rate is simply looking at the proportion of households who own their own home.
Yes. So this is just, I think this graph is, I really like this graph. You shouldn't overinterpret it, but it's very strong in its intuition. When it comes to saving for retirement, we grew older. Oh, sorry, yes. Comment.
If you could go back to your, there's another one. If you look at the countries with the higher rate of home ownership, most of them are former Soviet countries. So how do you explain, and most of the ones with the lower rate of home ownership are historically market economies. So what do you make out of that?
There are like country histories, country context, institutions matter. And there may be like non-linearities in what home ownership means in a country in terms of how people save and how we have structured market. We also see that some countries have had specific policies in promoting home ownership. The UK has had it for different waves. I mean, Franco regime had it in Spain. And as for the Eastern European countries, I just want to urge someone here to look into this. I haven't seen much work at all.
The communist countries just gave their housing stock away to the people that are living there. It wasn't someone making a positive decision to buy housing. It was just, it was given free. Russia, the whole of their housing stock was just given to the people who were living in there. And I think that's true of most of Eastern Europe, where they had socialist countries. So I don't think you can really deduce much about what their particular percentage of home ownership is. It's just a historical
Accident.
fluke.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Tony. So that's one really great answer. So we grew older over the 20th century. Our economies grew richer, technological development, institutional change. And what did it do with, in this graph, I just have this provoking, like a little bit, am I wrong, pension age picture, but it tells us that we started living many years past retirement, and that made us aware of the need for saving for retirement. So pension savings have gone up very, very dramatically in the Western world, no matter how you measure it. Actually, the mutual funds, by another maybe historical accident, is a fantastic financial innovation that has helped this development, democratizing the financial market, allowing people like us who are really interested maybe in stock markets to basically save and get the high returns from these risk-taking business people, and yet at a much lower risk level by having this mutual fund as a financial instrument. And that has been very positive in the pensions industry. So this picture shows also this evolution of the composition change in wealth ownership for the 6 countries. And it's striking, I think, that it's very similar across these countries. So the exact composition across how home ownership or homes and pension funds or pension long-term savings is a little bit different across these countries. But the shift and the greater the dominance of people's assets in total private wealth today is strikingly high. So a very big theme, of course, is what has been driving this growth of popular wealth. And this slide is very reductive, but I think the role of institutions the role of inclusive institutions, coming with the democratic transition, the extension of universal suffrage in the early 20th century, that also then set off educational reform, broadening educational attainment to many more people. We had labor laws, creating better circumstances in the working place. All of that made people better, more productive. Incomes could be raised and people could start saving. And this when they first started saving for a home, and then later they started saving for old age. So that, alongside with financial development and so on, is, I think, what is behind this growth of people building wealth from below over this course of history. Okay, now wealth inequality. So the top wealth shares is a very specific wealth inequality measurement. I mean, my good friend Rolf Åberge in Norway is one of the best inequality researchers. He doesn't think this is an inequality measure at all, because it doesn't really meet all the criteria. But I think it captures a lot, because you have stuff happening within the bottom or within the top, not changing the top 1% share, for example. But not so we have some Gini coefficients, but the problem is that we don't have much population data, granular population data historically. There's a mix of data sources historically. This last bullet point, consistency over time, has been at the forefront for the researchers producing these series. So sometimes we should be a little bit careful when interpreting the differences in levels across countries. So this is what I kind of frame as the great wealth equalization of the 20th century. This is what one question, was it confined to these 6 countries? So the 6 countries are there because we have the best data for them. But there are data for some other countries as well. This shows 8 of them. So the gray lines are the 6 ones in the main set series. And once again, we should be careful about interpreting levels, but they at least do not refute this long-term equalization of wealth holdings across the Western world. I think in fact they align pretty well with that. I mean, and it's also not too surprising maybe, because these are countries that are pretty similar to the ones I have in my main sample. Yes, Chico.
So if you look at Italy, Switzerland, Finland, Denmark, to some extent Australia with the observed data. There is a pickup in inequality from the 1980s, which is where Piketty and Size also see it. They don't dispute the decline elsewhere. I'm just being devil's advocate here. So I would say if I wanted to not help us sell your book, I would say, well, actually, there's not that much disagreement. You do see an increase in wealth in the same period that they do.
Well, yeah, I mean, I could agree with that. I mean, I think my main point is that this last era, we see not big changes. And I think in my world, in my thinking, if the top 1% share goes up by 3 percentage points, I know, for example, that could be driven by cohort effects like demographic shifts or so. It could be driven by short-term right stuff, but it could also have more profound reasons. Yes. In fact, I will show you a little bit more as we go along. If we narrow it down to the very top of the distribution, the question is the super rich. Maybe they evaded all of this equalization over time, but it doesn't seem like that. In fact, they also, experienced reduced relative position over the 20th century. But we also see that they have fared pretty well over the last years. And this we can see, and this has to do, of course, with globalization, being the best manufacturer of chairs and tables and so on, like Ingvar Kamprad. He could have been, without globalization, he could have been the richest guy in southeast Sweden. Now he became, perhaps the richest guy in the world because of globalization. We can see this. So, and this is another aspect of inequality analysis, which is challenging for inequality researchers. It depends on how you measure, where you look, maybe between which years. So we should always bear that in mind and so on. In passing, I don't think interpreting this development is the next thing. Is it a problem where we have successful entrepreneurs becoming wealthy embedded in democratic market economies and so on? We can discuss this. I will come back to this. So a few dimensions that have been overlooked in wealth inequality is, for example, women and wealth. So this picture, and I bring it up because does it change the narrative of equalization? Well, I cannot answer because I don't have good enough data. But this right wing, so the left graph here shows you that women are less and less represented in wealth, the wealth distribution, the higher up we get. Maybe not too surprising. The right picture here shows us that the gap between the average wealth ownership among women and men has been reduced over the 20th century. So this is data for Sweden. I don't know, I haven't seen any other data for any other country, but it's just indicative of this wealth equalization is seen in this dimension too. A recent paper in the QJE looked at the black-white wealth gap in the US. And they too find this huge equalization, or at least huge reduction in wealth gap. There is still a wealth gap, but it's much, much smaller today than it was historically. I have a couple of other dimensions. I mean, just to really make my point about our societies being more equal, this is perhaps one of the most important outcomes or dimensions of well-being that we care about: lifespans, how long we live. So when we use mortality data we can calculate a Gini coefficient for the inequality of lifespans in the population. And what it shows is, also in this dimension, we're living in a much more equal world today than in the past. It hasn't really gone up. I mean, so of course we could qualify this by having qualified life years and so on. But this is just an indication. And here, I mean, I also show this because we care about the global perspective, especially at the school. And here, data from the Global Wealth Report, which is actually created by that person in the back, Tony Shorrocks, showing more recent data from 2000 onward, that the world has become a richer place This is the left graph in the number, how wealthy we are in total. But looking at the Gini of global wealth, it has gone down from extremely high levels to 92 to still extremely high levels. But there's a downward trend. And this is, of course, has to do with the income generation in middle income countries. Anyway, I need to speed up a little bit, but that's nothing new when I present. So one way of understanding the mechanical drivers of wealth inequality over time could be to basically, and also in this understanding the role of the popular wealth versus elite wealth, is to try to differentiate between the top wealth group and its real wealth development and the bottom group and its real wealth development. This is what I do here. So I divide the 20th century into 3 periods and to see how inequality changed during those periods. And we saw this great equalization resulted in an average annual decreases in the top 1% share by more than 1%. Was it created by reductions of wealth of the rich? So these shocks to capital, lowering the top. Well, not so much. It didn't grow for them on average in the West between 1910 and 1950. Instead, we saw a growth on average among the bottom of the distribution. In the early post-war era, on average, the top group also experienced higher wealth growth because these were like the top glorious. I mean, these were the high growth economies. So the thing was just that the wealth of ordinary people grew even faster and created this equalization. And then for the most recent era, yes, we've seen those increasing gaps. And here we have seen the top group experiencing the fastest wealth growth, but not by taking wealth from the rest, that they should have a shrinking wealth. No, they too, the rest of the population has also experienced positive wealth growth. In fact, at a very high annual level. It's just that the ones at the very top have been just even more successful in generating assets, whatever that is. So in this, this also, I guess, again, tells us about how should we interpret inequality change. Well, it depends. Of course, it depends. If this was Russia, and we do have oligarchs here, this is another story. But if it's like people providing Google services and for free and becoming rich from that, it's something that enriches our lives, I think. Okay, I only told you that wars aren't maybe that important, but they of course have been important. And this picture just shows you that what I already said, that belligerent countries experience similar experiences as non-war participating countries. And also when we look at the immediate post-war effects, they were actually offsetting a lot of the wartime distractions during the war.
Just to say, you've got 5 minutes, and that's pretty binding because you have to leave.
Yeah, sure.
And I do want to give 5 minutes for questions.
Yes. So let me just rush through a little bit. Okay, sorry. Offshore wealth, pension wealth, public sector wealth inheritances. So people have tried to estimate the value of hidden wealth in tax havens. It's difficult. And also maybe even try to link it to people in rich countries. But what does it do? And this picture shows you that when we add the presumed wealth of rich people, mostly rich people in our countries, we see that top wealth shares actually increase. So when we add that column, we are actually more unequal than our official statistics. But we're not shifting 10% levels in top shares, but adding relatively modestly the top shares in all of these countries for which we have some data. Adding the transfer wealth, it's a big thing. One of the biggest institutional changes of the 20th century, the growth of government. So the growth of the welfare states. I think maybe it's the single most important achievement of Europe, Western Europe, historically. So people are trying to capitalize the future pension incomes and so on. And if they were instead saved privately, what if? So this is a glass half full, half empty exercise. No, we will never be happy no matter how we do it. And this picture shows the Gini coefficients. This is by Eva Sierminska, and of course, has done this picture, calculating the Gini with and without pension wealth, showing that this go like this present value of pension wealth. Ginis go down by on average 26%. We're like, and this is perhaps similar to including pension income in when we look at income inequality. It has a huge equalizing effect. And now with the national distribution of national accounts literature, adding also the welfare services that people get when and taking use of schooling subsidies and so on. So this is a little bit of a mirror image of this. We are much more equal in levels. And historically, this magnifies, you can see for Sweden, for US, this downward trend is magnified when we add this type of wealth. Inheritance is a chapter, we can talk about this a lot. One question, was inheritance a lot more, has it become much more important? Oh yeah, maybe. Maybe in some countries it differs a little bit. But historically, so this picture shows you the share of all wealth that was inherited was higher 100 years ago than it is today. Meaning we have a larger share of self-made wealth today than we've had in the past, at least for the few countries that we could do this kind of exercise from. And you know, there's a little bit where we look at inheritance flows or the share of inherited wealth. Looking at the very top, now I have to go to this Forbes data, the journalistic data, categorizing people as self-made or heirs in the very top. And for Sweden and for the US, since the 1980s, you see that the share of heirs is going down. Then the share of self-made among these billionaires is going up. At least indicating that there is some, you know, increasing dynamism in these economies, maybe related to technology, maybe related to globalization. I mean, the role of inheritance for wealth inequality statically has been studied. This picture shows you that the richer you are as an heir, the more money you will inherit on average. We have a positive wealth correlation and consideration. But the relative importance of the inheritance to your ownership is bigger the poorer you are as heir. So in fact, for all the countries that have been studied, Denmark, Sweden, the US, we have a reduction in wealth inequality. Yes. So policy lessons, final slide. I think we should, looking at the expansion of the economic pie, and that we see that both the bottom and top have experienced positive growth, should make us question zero-sum thinking in general in the economy. We learn from points 2 and 3 that home ownership and pension fund and pension plan saving has been equalizing forces. And then when it comes to, I mean, we should tax capital as well, but here, the last 2 points, wealth inequality has, of course, effects on other parts of society. I don't talk that much about that in my book, but it's of course important to underline that the implications of unequal societies in terms of wealth are different depending on if your door rights to welfare services are different. If you have to pay, you can pay your educate better schooling for your kids than if you cannot, or get better healthcare if you can pay for it, or if you cannot. And finally, for power, which is often brought up. Oh, we dislike wealth inequality because of the power problems. It can be that way. I mean, and especially looking again at Eastern Europe or like developing countries maybe. And also Trump and Berlusconi are the typical cases. However, I think let's fix the political system to shield it off from private influences in terms of campaign contributions, increase transparency, perhaps for media, have public service media, and let also people in business do their stuff so that we expand wealth and welfare and then shield off the potential bad consequences unless we get, you know, so this is just a very big, you know, fine. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was really, really interesting, and I think there are many provocative points. I think there's a lot that people would argue about. Sadly, we have little time because we had some questions from the room already. Let me ask first if there are any questions online.
Yeah, just one. Could Daniel please address the very bottom of the distribution where a significant share of the population nowadays in many countries has almost no or even negative wealth, doesn't lumping the bottom 90 or even 99% together mask too much of what is going on in that large group?
An extremely good question. So, so these are, of course, yes, lumping, bottom 99%, although, people did that on Wall Street as well, right? But still, it's definitely a mixed bag of people. So the bottom half in the wealth distribution owns typically nothing. It has a 0 share of total wealth. But what is striking, it's almost like a Pareto law. It's the same for Sweden today, US today, and it was like that 100 years ago as well. I mean, it's basically all wealth distributions, wherever you find them, it's gonna hover around 0%. Why? I mean, I actually have a section on this in the book, asset poverty, should we care? Well, actually, I don't think that much. Most of these people, or a large share, are young people who still have not saved. So there's a huge life cycle pattern in wealth ownership. So many of you here don't have that much, but you do have good lives. And so that's a fair share of the 0 of the bottom half. Then we have people renting, not perhaps saving so much for pension, but still living hand to mouth, and they're also pretty well off. So that's my question. We shouldn't be too concerned actually about the bottom half owning nothing. And read my book for more discussion about that.
That's probably the statement that you made that I like the least. But well,
Lucky I did it, with no time left.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this presentation. So my question is, if we admit that in the Western countries, we live in much more equal societies, does that mean, does that mean something in terms of social frustrations? So in the end of your analysis, do you take into account the perception of wealth inequality and maybe a potential discrepancy between what the masses think they deserve and what they get? And in the end, outside of the policy aspects, is your book an invitation to tell the masses that maybe you feel some frustrations, but actually you should not?
Exactly, it's a super great point as well. So are the rich too rich? I mean, my question would be, first, what is too rich? Or like, are you overpaid? Like, what is my correct salary? I don't know. I mean, my best guess is what someone is willing to pay me with his or her private money. That's my best guess as of now. And the same for my ownership. The market value, being the equilibrium of bidders and sellers for my assets. And if I do something very nicely, if I renovate my home, great, that will make me more well off. So I don't think that in the market economy and embedded in a democratic context, private property and so on, openness, being successful and becoming rich is not the problem. That is not the problem. It helps to expand, and it will inspire people to go and compete and take them down, which has happened all the time. OpenAI didn't exist 10 years ago. All of a sudden we have a big new player coming from below. I think this is how to think about this. Think less about taking them down and instead lifting the others. That's going to be a very important message, I think, from history, and that I think is the most constructive and welfare generating as well.
I was going to say no more questions, but we can't refuse Tony Short.
Thank you. 2 points really. One is all the other talks I've listened to this year say wealth inequality is going up and we've got to stop it. And you're coming along and giving a different perspective. But having come along now, I'm not sure you would persuade the people that think wealth inequality is going up, because they're talking about a different time period. That when people say, when you ask people, do you think wealth inequality is going up or not? Maybe they're thinking about 10 years, 20 years, maybe 30 years at the very most. They're not talking about 100 years. So I'm not sure whether you're going to persuade people that wealth inequality is going down when they're looking at it from a different perspective. The second thing is, actually, even if you look at it for the last 20 or 30 years, it's not clear that wealth inequality is going up. It really depends on the country. The US, is maybe going up a little bit, but it's not a striking increase. Some of the countries are pretty flat, maybe even going down a little bit. The two countries or three countries which are noticeable are China, India, and Russia, where certainly over the last 3 years, and these are all countries which were either going from in transition countries, they start from a very little personal wealth. So it's not really surprising that wealth inequality has gone up. So, I mean, I'm merely saying, and then you also, as you pointed out, using my data, from the global perspective, there's a huge increase in average wealth in China and India and other countries, and that's really reduced on a global scale differences if you look at the population of the world.
Can I give you
30 seconds.
30 seconds? So great points, Tony. So I think we're obsessed with changes. All the news headlines, it should always be a change, regardless of whether it's just like 0.1% change. It's like, oh, it has increased or decreased. I think the recent era hasn't seen that much of inequality in wealth increasing at all. I think, and to the extent that it's people doing good stuff, I think it could even be positive. Should we prefer these entrepreneurs to go bankrupt, or should we prefer them making losses instead of profits? No, of course not. So I take your point, and I think we should be very careful about the size of these changes. Not only that it's changes, so this is kind of the Deirdre McCloskey critique, the magnitudes. So
I'm going to just add to this. If you look at the data now, I'm more and more convinced as I looked at the data in details. Asset prices have really changed over the last 20 to 30 years, and they really affect both the levels and the distribution. You look at myself, I look at the fact that how this has happened is inflation is being reduced in most countries, and that to some extent reflects central bank independence and quantitative easing. We have reduced inflation. That has reduced the real level of interest. You reduce real interest rates, asset prices go up. And you look at historically what has happened. Look at the last 10 years in the US. Just look at the share prices. It's gone up, exploded in a way it's just not historically. It's a change in the historical trend, and you can almost date it to 2008, the financial crisis. What happens then is you look, the variations each year just reflect in each country just what's happening to share prices, what's happening to house prices. And if you take those out, actually if you like, the stock of real wealth, real assets that people own hasn't changed very much. Basically, it goes up roughly in line with income. So if you look at the wealth to income ratio, it hasn't changed very much. The thing is, it's just like people hold exactly the same assets. They're just getting richer because they're higher value. And that, if you don't take that into account, I think you're get a very distorted view about what's happening, not just to the level, but also inequality because of the differences in composition at different points in the distribution.
Thank you, Tony. That also relates to one, in some ways, my earlier question. But we have to close, unfortunately. In thanking Daniel, let me just say also, take 1 minute to say something, particularly for the younger people here. The job of academics is to question and to research and to challenge narratives and look at the data again, rather than to accept the dominant view. Daniel has done an amazing service to the profession by writing this book. There may be things we disagree with, but I think it's a really important book, and we're delighted to have had you here. Thank you.